What's going on, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to the Fringe. Alberta prosperity is the big talk of the town as Cam Davies lost his ability to take a seat in central Alberta with the Alberta Republicans. Now the question comes along with outfits like APP, Danielle Smith now playing the field. What does it mean for Alberta moving forward? What is the best path to Alberta independence? And is Alberta independence the best option? Well, joining me today on the channel, none other than former MP and reform legend Preston Manning to talk about where he thinks Alberta needs to go from here. Preston Manning, a towering figure in Canadian politics, has left an indelible mark on the nation's landscape. Born in 1942 in Edmonton, Alberta, the son of Social Credit Premier Ernest Manning, he grew up steeped in public service. Armed with a degree in economics from the University of Alberta, Manning founded the Reform Party of Canada in 1987, giving voice to Western Canada's frustrations with Ottawa's establishment. As leader of the official opposition from 1997 to the year 2000, he championed fiscal responsibility, democratic reform, and regional representation, reshaping the Conservative movement and paving the way for the modern Conservative Party of Canada. After retiring from Parliament in 2002, he established the Manning Centre for Building Democracy, fostering conservative ideas and grassroots engagement. Today at 83, Manning remains a passionate advocate for Western Canada, promising a Canada West Assembly to explore options for the region's future, including independence-oriented proposals for Alberta as a response to growing alienation from federal policies. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, Preston Manning, former MP in the House of Commons, visionary for the Western Canada as well. An extensive resume. Preston Manning, welcome to the channel. It's great to have you here. Thank you for taking the time to sit down with me today and discuss the future of not just Alberta, but essentially the West.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
It's my pleasure. The pleasure, believe me, is all mine. Preston, I need to ask a little bit about how we got here, how you think Alberta's made it to this stage of the game. You flash back to the 90s and the Reform Party days with Stockwell Day. The most famous quote that people often bring up is when you said the West wants in. Many people ask the question, what do you think would happen if Preston Manning had ever said the West wants out? Surely disdain has been around Albertans, and it's been what's considered, no pun intended, kind of a fringe sentiment in the last few decades. But now its popularity is growing to the point that we're looking at a referendum vote in 2026. How do you think we got here from the 90s till now?
Well, back in that time, of course, there was a number of proposals for strengthening the West position within the Federation. One was to create a Western-based political party that ultimately was able to transform and take over one of the traditional parties, the former Progressive Conservative Party of Canada. And so that was quite a long exercise, which was successful in the sense of eventually creating the Harper government and it being in power for 9 years. What caused that at the beginning was almost the same thing as today, that Pierre Trudeau imposed the National Energy Program, which confiscated billions of dollars worth of wealth from Western Canada, from the oil and gas producers, and produced this Western alienation. And the Conservative government of Brian Mulroney took a contract that had been won by a company in Winnipeg and transferred it to Montreal. And this series of events caused this Western alienation, which gave rise to the Reform Party of Canada. And it's ironic that today you've got some of the similar circumstances producing again Western unrest and raising the question again, should the West try to change the nature of the Federation to balance and take care of the West's interests, or should it try to get out? And that's one of the current issues, as you know, is being discussed.
Right. Now, if we look at, at the time of filming this video, last night's by-election, that took place, many eyes in the province that were on Cam Davies and the Alberta Republican Party, where he eventually, well, he lost his seat. He wasn't going to get in. A lot of eyes were saying that this is going to set the sentiment as for discussions of independence in Alberta. And I think that in my opinion, it should have been grassroots from the beginning. I'm not so sure whether or not we need a new political party in the legislature, though it is nice to see a little bit of accountability once in a while within the legislative assembly. But essentially, I know Cam Davies was part of a meeting that Marty up north had talked about, that you were present at, and other options were being discussed. And as you and I said off the record, well, off this video at least, that there are many parties involved now. So I guess the question for you, Mr. Manning, is where do you think is the best direction for Alberta to head if it's seeking its
Well,
independence from the federal government?
well, I'd say, Derek, first of all, there has to be a discussion on that and what are the options? What are the
Mhm.
options for Western Canada to deal with its discontents? And there's a number of them on the table besides secession. Secession is one of them, but it's only one of about 5 or 6. It's the one that gets the most attention from the media, particularly the Eastern media, because it's flashy and it seemed to be extreme. But we have to look at the other options as well. The first one is this list of demands that Premier Smith and Premier Moe have presented to the federal government, 15 to 20 things, everything from repealing Bill C, the No Pipelines Act, to repealing the clean electricity emissions regulations, to there's a whole list of them. So that's one option. How will the federal government respond to them? If it did 12 out of the 15, would the West feel more at home, its concerns addressed? That's one option to look at. So far, there's not been much response from the federal government, so they'll be looking at that. A second option is the so-called autonomy option or sovereignty option. And this is where Quebec has pushed this further than anybody else, but should the West pursue it as well. And what it involves is beefing up the provincial government in every single area that the Constitution assigns to the provinces. This is sovereignty within the federation. It's not separation, but it's beefing up the provincial presence and the provincial powers. There's just been a report tabled in the Quebec legislature with 42 recommendations on how to do that, some of which the West could probably borrow. A third, I don't know if you call it an option, but it ought to be a slot on the list, is how is the federal government in central Canada going to respond to all of this? If they don't respond at all, then there'll be demands for more extreme action. If they do respond, then that might conceivably improve the West's position within the Federation to the point where it wants to stay and wants to build it. But then one of the other options is the secession option, and it's split between two possibilities there. One is the secession to form an independent country. The other is to secede with the intent of forming some kind of union with the United States. So these are the major options. 3 or 4 of them are federalist options within the Federation, but 2 of them do pertain to secession. And this province needs to have a discussion on the pros and cons of each of those, and ultimately some recommendations be made to the provincial governments as to which one, in the judgment of the people of the province, is the one that ought to be pursued.
Right,
That's
and I guess that's part of
that's my long dissertation on the
no problem. I
possibility.
I think that's one of the reasons I wanted to bring that up, because when I follow what Alberta Prosperity is doing, when you look at again the Republican Party of Alberta, even with Premier Danielle Smith recently putting out essentially a reel about wanting a sovereign um, government within a united Canada. There's many options on the table, and it just seems to be everybody isn't on the same page. There isn't all the there hasn't been really a discussion. It's multiple people again with the Alberta Prosperity Project saying, let's just get to a vote on a ballot and a referendum. You've got guys like Cam Davies saying, hey, maybe we start talking about leaving altogether. Other people like Danielle Smith have said, hey, let's follow Quebec's model and be kind of a nation within a nation. Um, if you were in Danielle Smith's shoes, and I'm certainly not asking you to speak on her behalf, but theoretically, if you were in that position, with the disdain that's in Alberta, we've seen roughly reportings coming out that somewhere between 47 to 51% are standing in favor, depending on which poll you follow, in terms of talking some form of independence. How do you qualm uh, the voices of Alberta that have had enough while also trying to find a way to do what's beneficial to stay in confederation?
Well, a couple of things. I think first of all, you have to lay out what are all the options. Like,
Mhm.
what are the realistic options? The secession is one of them, but it's only one out of a number of others. So I think, first of all, there has to be a dialogue in the province on what are those major options. And then some decisions have to be made as to which would be the best one to follow. And probably it's not going to come down to one or the other. It's going to come down to some combination of them. Do you try to get this list approach advanced? And if the federal government responds, does that make any kind of difference? Do you pursue the sovereignty autonomy option more vigorously? Which what does that result in? With the secession option at the far end of the spectrum. One of the other things that needs to be understood, Derek, is that there are people both in Quebec and in Alberta who think that if you won a referendum on secession with a clear question and a clear majority, say 60, 65%, which no one's anywhere near that yet, but suppose you got it. What
Mhm.
happens then? You don't float off into independence land. That's not what
Right.
happens at all. What happens under the law, if you're willing to obey the law, under the Clarity Act and the rulings of the Supreme Court on the Clarity Act, is what that does is trigger a federal provincial constitutional conference in which the federal government and the other provinces are obligated to negotiate in good faith, to use the language of the Supreme Court, and in accordance with certain principles. So if you were to get to that situation, what would virtually happen is you'd have a chance to rewrite the Constitution. It would blow up the current Constitution. And one of the things the West has to think about is, if you ever got into that situation, what would the West propose? If the West could rewrite the Constitution of Canada, what would reconfederation look like? That would be well worth thinking through, because that's the situation you might actually get into if somebody won a referendum on secession. And the most likely place what that is to occur in the next number of years is Quebec, not
Mhm.
in Alberta, but it would provide an opportunity to blow up the current constitution so you have a chance to rewrite it, maybe.
Well, and I think that's really what's on a lot of Albertans' minds, is that whether or not discussing the possibility of a referendum vote sends a message to Ottawa. It's been made very clear with this Carney government that only worked 17 days before taking summer vacation that they haven't really brought anything up. When Mark Carney was asked about it, he simply said, "Well, I'm from Edmonton. I know how I'd say if somebody asked me if I wanted to
Well,
remain
even
in Canada."
that joke didn't work. Like, he put on an Oilers jersey, but he
Yep.
forgot that in Canada there's a whole bunch of other people that hate the Oilers, mainly Vancouver,
Well,
Calgary, and Winnipeg. So if you win one vote, you lost three by
yeah,
putting on the.
always a mistake,
But
but
no, I
it's
think you're making a good point, though. There's no indication at all that Carney either understands or appreciates the regional character of Canada. There's not been a flicker of recognition of that. Secondly, there's been no recognition at all of the resource sectors: agriculture, energy, mining, forestry, and the fishery, as fundamental building blocks of the economy, which Trudeau treated as relics from the past, and or even environmental liabilities. So that there's been no recognition of those fundamentals about Canada at all from the Carney administration, which is not very encouraging. I don't think, for the country as a whole, if you want economic recovery, and certainly not encouraging from the Western perspective.
certain. Well, it only sows more division. And when you read up on materials such as his book Values,
Yes,
it
yes.
starts to paint a picture as to what Canadians can at least expect, hypothetically, from a Carney government. So I guess my question now is how do we rewrite things? What should Alberta be focusing on when you look at people having disdain when it comes to seats in the Senate, representation, electoral reform, and where our votes count? If we were to say, well, we don't necessarily want to leave Canada, but we want a more fairer option. I've often heard people say, like, the reason you never hear Pierre Poilievre or any of these guys talk about it, any form of electoral reform or changing the system, is because it would be political suicide in Ottawa. So how does Alberta get a better stake in the game at this point, aside from a referendum ballot,
Well,
when Carney
probably
doesn't want to do anything?
Yeah, well, I'm probably repeating myself, but I think a starting point is to identify what these main options are and have a
Yeah.
province-wide discussion on what the options are. And then having a realization of what the options are, trying to decide what's the best one to pursue, or is there some combination of them to pursue? And some of these things are things that can get support in other parts of Canada. Federal provincial relations right now are not in a good state. The federal government does not have a good relationship with any province, and partly because of the intrusion of the federal government in areas of provincial jurisdiction. If the Conservatives had been elected in the last government, my hope would have been that one of the first acts they would pass would be what I would call an act respecting provincial jurisdiction, in which they would amend the federal statutes whereby the federal government intrudes in areas of provincial responsibility: healthcare, natural resources, municipal governments, and civil liberties. If they did that, and that's something that would have support from virtually every provincial government across the country. This is not just a Western thing, although the West might lead it. I think that would have been a positive step in the right direction. But to try to answer your question, I think the first thing is to get these options clearly defined. I understand people that want to do the secession thing. Winning a referendum doesn't mean you can float off into independence land. It starts a federal provincial conference on the, but it's on the subject of the secession, so it's a step forward. And discussing these options and trying to come to some kind of decision, which is the best course of action for Alberta.
Right. So let's wind the clocks back, let's say 25, 30 years. And let's say a Preston Manning who's still in the House of Commons looks at the landscape from here on. What do you think the best plan moving forward then would be? Is it for Alberta Prosperity and other issue like other groups that are facilitating these things to sit down with entities like Premier Smith and maybe discuss set options, or where? How do you think we get there? I guess is what I'm
Well,
asking.
I think there's talk, and this is all very embryonic now, of creating some kind of independent assembly where these options could be presented, they could be debated, and some kind of voting done, and then recommendations made to the provincial governments based on that. This is all quite premature, whether that'll happen or not, but that would be one way to handle this. And this may appear to be not quite connected to the subject, but I think it is. There's virtually no place in the country where you can have democratic discussion anymore. It doesn't happen in the legislatures. They're polarized between, the government and the opposition. It certainly doesn't happen in the Parliament of Canada. But could you create an assembly first, let's say for a week or something, where everyone that came to it agreed to participate in a democratic way, which means you will listen to a presentation made by others. You're going to get your chance to say yours, but you got to listen to the other guy. You're going to have cross-examination, questions and strengths, and not with the intention of destroying the other person, but getting out the strengths and the weaknesses of whatever they propose. And then at the end of the day, you're going to have some votes as to which of these things, some combination of them or one of them, that you would recommend to the provincial government if you had the opportunity to do so. I think being able to have some kind of forum where that kind of discourse could be demonstrated, that it's still possible to have democratic discourse in its classic sense, that would be a very helpful exercise, and particularly if it was focused on this issue of how to deal with the West's current discontents.
When we talk about a Western Assembly, I think that if cooler heads were to prevail, I think that is probably the best form of action, especially when it comes to negotiating at the table. I guess what a lot of Albertans struggle with, and in particular people that live in Saskatchewan as well, that I hear a lot that chime into the show saying, "Look, we've had enough too. We're done. It's our resources, it's our jobs, it's our inability to pay our mortgages. The government isn't listening to us." I guess what I struggle to think of is what kind of message do we have to send before Mark Carney or any federal government is going to take the West seriously? Because when you look at the Senate seats and when you look at, again, the way our votes are counted, it seems like we're just filling butts in chairs when it comes to our federal election. And aside from transfer payments, we're really not taken seriously. So how do we get to the point that the federal government is willing to listen to us and take us seriously, do you
Well,
think?
I think if you can start to show that there is public support and support from your provincial government for one of these options or some combination of that, this, you've seen these colored maps of after the last federal election. It's all red east of Manitoba and all blue west of Manitoba. The country is seriously divided. And I think if the West can put together, this is the kind of changes that we are looking for and that the federal government has to respond to. And if they don't respond to, then the West will take even more extreme action. I think the point you make too, and this is a thing that the Eastern media miss, particularly the Carney Broadcasting Corporation, that's the new name of the CBC. Yeah. They think this is just an Alberta phenomenon. And as you alluded to, the polls indicate this discontent with the current situation is just as strong, even slightly stronger in Saskatchewan. It's strong in rural Manitoba, maybe not Winnipeg, but a big part of the rest of Manitoba. And it's strong in eastern, central, and northern British Columbia, basically 3/4 of the province, except for the Vancouver and Victoria. This is not just an Alberta thing. It's a bigger thing. And when you start, if you're a federal government, you see virtually half the country, and particularly the part of the country that champions the resource sectors, which is the one sector, the economy that's actually producing some positive effects on the GDP. I don't think you can't ignore that. Or if you do ignore it, you run the risk of blowing the country apart.
Well, with that, Mr. Manning, I think we'll wait and see, I guess, what transitions over the summer. I've heard a lot of people talking about getting information out, rallying again, and this is multiple provinces, not just Alberta.
Yeah.
I guess it's on the shoulders of Mark Carney and the Liberals to decide what they want to do in the fall, as well as the work of Danielle Smith. There's a lot of cogs in the works. Hopefully, people can come to the table and find some meaningful discourse to form a Western alliance.
Right now, if you had to, I've known a fair number of premiers in my day. Right now, the strongest premiers on this theme are Premier Smith of Alberta and Premier Moe of Saskatchewan. Mm-hmm. They listen to these various options. They've done some specific things on 2 or 3 of them. So it's not as if there's absolutely nobody in government that's paying attention to this issue or listening to it. There's at least 2 premiers that are.
Well, and hopefully they continue to push forward. And it's, I guess what a lot of people are starting to see and where the frustration mounts is Danielle has given this list. And while I've said from the beginning, I don't think the federal government will say, sure, we'll just give you everything or most things on that list. It's going to be slow and steady. But a lot of people think that because of that, she's playing kind of both sides of the field when it comes to talking about independence and also pushing for a sovereign Canada.
Well,
I think there's a fine line.
Yeah, no, I think that's erroneous. The other thing that she's done, and I think Moe supports it too, is push this autonomy sovereignty option. Mm-hmm. That's something fundamentally different than the list. That's strengthening the provincial governments in virtually every area that the Constitution says is their responsibility. That's a fundamental thing too, and it's another thing that to test that is something that the federal government can do by introducing an act in the federal parliament that accomplishes it. So it's a very specific thing. Do they do that or do they not do that? So they're pushing on that front as well. Yeah.
We'll see how the tensions mount in the fall, I guess, and what Danielle does over the summer or what Scott Moe wants to do moving forward. Again, the rumblings going through that we might see something through to Churchill. Anyone's guess is as good as mine because, like I said, Mark Carney worked for 17 days and decided to take a vacation. So we'll see, I guess, what comes out in the fall, where we end up. But Preston, I really appreciate you coming on the channel, taking the time to sit down and talk with us and also give us your insight. Again, I thank you for your time in the House and everything that you've done for this country. You're definitely still one of the most looked upon MPs that has one of the best insights for the West. So again, thank you for sitting down and discussing with us today.
Thank you for saying that. Thank you, Derek.
Thank you. Appreciate having you on. Take care.
Okay.